Welcome to our third video in marketing ethics. Before we jump into this one, what are ethics, just let's take a quick review of what happened in the previous video. During the course of this semester, we're going to be looking at several different ethics philosophers. And fortunately for us, they agree on very little, which means we're going to have a bunch of different ways to approach really challenging ethics dilemmas. Interestingly, they do agree on two or three key things. They do agree that what human beings want more than anything else in life is happiness. And again, we can call that fulfillment, contentment. Aristotle called it eudaimonia, good spirit, which meant just firing on all cylinders, mentally, physically, spiritually, everything. But they agree that's what we want. And maybe even more important for us, this contentious group of people also agrees that being ethical is indispensable to happiness. It's not a guarantee, but if we are not being ethical people, these great diverse minds say we have no chance of living the happy, fulfilled, meaningful life that we seek. So there's a wrap up of our previous video, and it leaves us with a big concern, I hope, for our own good. We need to develop a really solid understanding of what it means to be ethical and how we achieve that. So let's, a good place to start. Video number 3 here. What are ethics? The key points of video number 3 are going to be, what do experts say the definition of ethics is? Second bullet here, what is our class's definition of ethics? We can dispute this if we want to, but we need a working definition of what we're going to talk about. And so I'll have a really standard one for you that I think will function really well for us this semester. This next bullet, second to last, is maybe one of the most important things in this short lecture, and really one of the most important things this whole semester. The connection, the importance of values to ethics. The connection of values to ethics. Boy, is that going to be a big deal for us this semester. And then, interesting, I'm a professor, so I want to look and see what the scholarly research says about marketing ethics. And some of the readings we're going to do will also deliver some of that to you. But what do the people who study marketing ethics say about it? So a good early question for us is going to be, what are ethics? This is something that Plato insisted on. If we're going to talk about anything, we have to define what it is we're talking about. We have to get a clear understanding of it. So let's go to some of those great minds of the ethics philosophers, and Kant in particular. Immanuel Kant spent a lot of time trying to explain what he was talking about. He said one definition of ethics, the first bullet here, rules of right conduct that tell us what we ought to do. And one of the interesting things about Kant and our other philosophers, we're going to look at about 5 basic philosophers and philosophies in this course. Every one of us, thank goodness, is going to give us a really specific rule, a way of thinking about ethics. These rules of right conduct that Kant talks about. So if you're trying to lead your marketing team through an ethics dilemma, within a few weeks, you're going to be able to say, well, here's how Aristotle would tell us to think about it. Here's how Kant would tell us. Here's how Rawls would tell us. Here's how Mill would tell us, and a couple more beyond that. I think you're going to be really valuable to a discussion like that. And a bonus is you're going to look really smart. This next one has a lot of personal meaning to me. An effort to reduce moral complexity by applying general rules. If you remember the anecdote, the ethics dilemma that I had in the Isaac Asimov situation that I discussed in the first lecture, should I fire probably the most famous writer in the world who doesn't deserve to be fired? Moral complexity is what I was wrestling with, and it was terrible. And I didn't know this definition at the time, but it would have had a lot of traction for me. I needed, for my own well-being, to reduce moral complexity. I sure wish I would have known some of those general rules. I think those two are interesting background. One I'd like you to remember for the benefit of this course is this third bullet on integrity. That's a big word in ethics. It's going to be a big word in the readings for our first few weeks. Um, Most of us use the word integrity, but just like ethics, maybe we're not very precise about defining it. I think it's going to be useful to look at the word the way that the Latins looked at it, the Romans, the people who invented the word. It comes from their word integer. And get this, integrity, it means more than honesty. It means more than being a stand-up person. It means that your values and actions are integrated. You can hear the word integrated in the word. Think about that. Integrity means that your values and your actions are integrated, that you have thought a lot about your values and your actions reflect your values. And anybody who's seeing your actions can make a really good guess at what your values are. This is going to be super important for our class's definition of ethics. This concept of integrity, that it means your values and your actions are utterly integrated, inseparable. I've probably confessed before that all my college degrees are in English literature. I got a doctorate in the 18th century British novel and still ended up in marketing. I do like to go to literature for clarifying examples. And a modern writer and a not so modern writer have some interesting thoughts for us here on that I think relate to our definition of ethics. Remember, and especially integrity, that concept of integrity being the integration of values and actions. With that in mind, look at this quote from the modern novelist Barbara Kingsolver and think about this in terms of this as if she were talking about values. Here's what I've decided. The very least you can do in your life is figure out what you hope for, what you value. And the most you can do is live inside that hope. Not admire it from a distance, but live right in it, under its roof. Imagine being really clear on what your values are and living within that environment. Apply the same values framework to Henry David Thoreau, the author of Walden here. Be not simply good. That's certainly important, but be not simply be good. Be good for something. One way to read that is be good in the sense that your values are coming to life in your actions. That's a huge part of ethics, and I think you can see us building up to a key definition here. As I say, I think you could see this coming. Our class's definition of ethics is values in action. Values in action. And let's go full Plato here again and get really picky about a key word at this moment, values. What do we mean by values? Here's our class's definition of values for the semester. A concept to which you attach great worth. A concept you attach great worth to. In other words, you'll fight for that concept. You'll go to the wall for it. It's something with deep meaning to you. Ethics experts say that most of us tend to have 4 to 6 core values, those concepts that absolutely mean the most to us. We'll talk more about this in a bit, but one of the shortest assignments you'll ever do, but I think one of the most interesting ones, it's for this class, is to write your own values statement. Very short, so you make every word count. But what for you are those 4 to 6 core values? That if our experts are right, if our philosophers are right, if you did your best to live those out throughout the rest of your life, you would substantially increase your chances of happiness. And I'm going to argue also substantially increase your chances of leadership. So this is an idea worth understanding. The idea of values becomes very important to our understanding of ethics. Let's look at it a little bit deeper. Kant tells us that there are basically 2 kinds of values, intrinsic and instrumental values. And intrinsic values are those 4 to 6 core values that you have, those things that lead directly to happiness. That Mill says they don't even lead directly to happiness. They are happiness. They're so associated with happiness, it's impossible to say they lead there. Just enacting them is happiness. If that's a little bit vague, I think it's easier to understand when we get to that second one, instrumental values. Again, I hope I've said all this right. Intrinsic values are those 4 to 6 core values that you have. Instrumental values are things that are still important to you, but they're not within that core group. An instrumental value is an instrument that leads to a higher value, the way that maybe money is an instrumental value that leads to security for your family. And let's say that security for your family is a core value, maybe. Anyway, instrumental values just lead to higher values. Still very important, but they're not intrinsic values. One reason for understanding this is, let's say you're in an ethics dilemma and values are clashing. Well, maybe some are instrumental and some are intrinsic. Uh, Experts say you're probably going to want to honor those intrinsic values first. One other hair-splitting definitional thing we're going to do is involved in this last bullet: ethics, values, and morals. One reason we don't have a textbook in this class is the textbooks tend to use these words interchangeably. And I think this is sloppy thinking. I'm sorry to sound so biased and know-it-all, but sloppy thinking in an important area, an area that's indispensable to our chances of happiness and leadership. So we know what our class's definition of ethics is: values and action. We know what our class's of values is, a concept to which we attach great worth. What do we mean by morals? For this class, we're going to go with a standard definition. A moral is a value. A moral is a particular kind of value. Morals are values that deal with religious and/or sexual content. Morals are values that deal with religious and/or sexual content. So, all morals are values, but not all values are morals, at least in this way of thinking. Another way to look at ethics is to look at the history of the word itself. The Greek root of ethics is ethos, that means character. Character. Think about that in terms of values in action and its relation to character. That makes a lot of sense to me. Something equally interesting and kind of scary to me is the Indo-European root, the pre-Greek version of that word. Don't even ask me to pronounce this. It's SWE with the W in parentheses. We're relying on linguistic scholars for this. But there's a particular family of words that come from that root. One of them is ethics, but the others are sober, solitary, sullen, and suicide. That's not a very happy linguistic family tree. And I just wonder if buried in language is the concept that even though leading the ethical life is indispensable to happiness, if our philosophers are right, it may not always be easy. Look at those words that it's associated with. We've been getting pretty philosophical and esoteric, so let's bring it back down to earth for just a while. People who study ethics, especially business ethics and marketing ethics, what does their research show? One is not encouraging in terms of leadership, happiness, the business we're all in or anticipating being in. The majority of business students would act unethically in situations involving personal advancement or profits. Fortunately, the study also showed that many of them had not had courses in ethics. A second one I think is interesting. Marketing managers can be sorted into 5 different categories: crooks, legalists who say, well, if it's legal, it's ethical. Think about that. There may be some distance between those two concepts. Rationalizers, well, I shouldn't do this, but I'll do it this one time because of special circumstances. Seekers, people who are constantly challenging themselves and social norms and just considering options. The authors of this study said these people seem to be the ones with the most leadership potential. And then finally, interestingly, moralists, who they put at the top of the scale, but these are people who are pretty sure what their values are, and they're not willing to negotiate. The moralists are kind of the my way or the highway group. You might think about the leaders in your own organizations you've been with, where they fit in that, and even where you fit into that. Research, and it could be wrong, suggests that it's best to be a seeker. Something that will please many of you. Research shows that female marketers are more in compliance with traditional marketing ethics than male marketers. And we'll get some interesting reasons for, if this is true biologically, why that might be. This next one, number 4, I hope is a relief. Values cannot successfully be taught in a one-semester ethics course. This course sure is not about teaching you what your values are, what they should be. You're the only one that can do that. Um, where I think we will be able to add something to your professional and personal portfolios is what are some really effective ways of acting on those values when the path forward isn't clear. But the goal of this class is not to tell you what your values ought to be. Thank goodness. Um, and then again, encouraging this last point, or the last point on this slide, ethics courses can improve your ability to act ethically, particularly courses that involve problem solving. And that's going to be the last 2/3 of our course, case study after case study after case study. So a lot of applied problem solving to come. Here's our last research slide and our second to last slide in this amazing lecture. Corporate ethics training programs can be highly effective, but few organizations provide them. And so I hope that's a leadership entrance for many of you that might be interested in this. One bonus point for having such programs is under the federal sentencing guidelines, the U.S. federal sentencing guidelines, I'm not making this up, your penalties for such things as bribery, such malfeasance as bribery and similar things, your penalties can be cut in half. Prison time, financial penalties, if you can show your organization has made an effort to have an effective ethics and legislative compliance program. We'll come back to that point. It's complicated, but there are bonus points for trying to do the right thing. So there's certainly incentive to have such programs. This last point gets a bit complex. Kohlberg and moral development, and that's his term. I wish it were ethical development. The point here is Kohlberg, Lawrence Kohlberg, and that's Lawrence with a U, not like Lawrence the city. Kohlberg's studies over decades showed that people are capable of moral development. We can improve. As good as you are right now in ethical compliance and living out your values, you probably can be even better, according to Kohlberg's extensive research. And he says basically there are 3 levels of ethical behavior. There's the pre-conventional stage, and that's children and toddlers. It's where the whole world is about me. Everything revolves around you. You don't want to share your toys. Very pre-conventional. Well, most of us grow up and evolve to the conventional stage. We enter into human relationships and we go along to get along. We realize it's not all about us. We have to accommodate and make compromises. And that's where most of us stay, he says, just in ethical compliance. We go along to get along. He says the third stage that some people get to, the stage that the leaders get to, the stage that the seekers from that earlier study get to, is the post-conventional stage, where you're challenging yourself. You're challenging your own values. You're politely challenging the values of others around you. You're challenging social norms. You can see how this would get irritating. So keep it in moderation, but challenge your beliefs. We've seen such progress in this over several decades. LGBTQ rights, greater steps toward racial equality. I know we've got a long way to go in all of those areas, but what we accept now as a social convention, we didn't accept decades ago. So socially, progress is possible, and Kohlberg shows that that happens through individuals challenging social norms. So that would be the highest stage of moral development, according to Kohlberg. We've spoken so much about values in this video that I want to leave you with a word of reassurance. Um, I didn't say this. Professor LaRue Hosmer from University of Michigan said this several years ago. And I read it and sure agreed with it. Again, I wish he'd stay away from the word moral, but I'll get off my soapbox on that. But again, the bottom line here is this class is not to teach you what your values ought to be. How arrogant would that be? So I'd slightly change the wording, but I agree with this final word from LaRue Hosmer. I do not want to teach moral standards. I want to teach a method of moral reasoning through complex issues. Sounds like Kant, doesn't it? Through complex issues so that students can apply the moral standards they have. Of course, I will not be displeased if the students' moral sensitivities have been increased and their moral standards have been reinforced. That sounds like a noble goal for us.